Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new series, Draft Questions Answered, the video series where I answer questions submitted by you, the viewer, about how to get better at Limited. In this first episode, I have a bunch of questions to get to, but before I dive in, I do want to remind you to hit that thumbs up button. This is the pilot episode of the show, so I'm going to be using it to see whether there is interest in this sort of topic. So I will continue to make episodes of the series if this video gets to 150 likes. So if you enjoy seeing your questions answered, if you want to get your questions answered in the future, be sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel so you get notified when I post future videos and can see when you have your questions answered. Without further ado, let's dive into the first question from Meister Pumuckl, and it says, when is the last point to switch to another second color in draft? So it seems like he's asking when it's the last time you can branch into another direction, and I think generally the last time I would do this is very early in pack 2. So sometimes in draft you can start with very deep in one color, so maybe you take about 6 or 7 black cards in pack 1, and you have a couple of cards in the other colors, but nothing too clear, and then in pack 2 you open up a really good card in a brand new color. So maybe you have a bunch of black cards, a couple red cards, a couple blue cards, and then you open up a really good green card. A lot of the times you can just take that green card, accept the fact that maybe green isn't going to be open in pack 3, and then just use your strong black base supplemented with a couple of green cards and build a black green deck with that very strong green card from pack 2. Sometimes you'll get past a really strong green card like the second pick of pack 2 and you can do the same thing, but generally after that point it's a little bit too late. You're not going to make playables, and oftentimes it's very dangerous to switch colors in pack 2, because if you switch in pack 2 to a color that wasn't open in pack 1, guess what? You're going to be passed to by the same person in pack 3 that you were in pack 1. That color is going to be cut once again, and your deck could end up in shambles. So generally, the newer you are at draft, the earlier you want to commit to your 2 colors. Within reason, you don't want to commit too soon. Like I generally say around pick 5, if you're a newer player, you want to commit to your 2 colors. But if you're more experienced and you are deep in one color, then early pack 2 is probably about the latest you could switch to a second color. Good question. Next up from Amelia Kozlowska, what is the number one mistake a lot of draft players make, and what can they do to fix it? So I would say that, like I answered in the first question, a big mistake that a lot of players make is knowing when to commit to their colors. And I would generally say that newer players in particular oftentimes zoom in on their first pick rare way too much, and oftentimes refuse to detach from that. And a way that they can fix that issue is by choosing a set pick limit before the draft that they will stay completely open until they get to that pick. So if they're a newer player, I recommend 5. It's a pretty good system. You're not going to train wreck too often if you have committed to your colors by pick 5, but it does, having that hard thing in set beforehand means that you are going to have a guideline for yourself. So if you say, okay, I'm going to wait until pick 5 to commit to my 2 colors, and you open up a really strong red card, you have to make sure that you do stay flexible until pick 5, and that way you can have a chance to see signals develop. And maybe if you don't see another single playable red card, you know to abandon red because you have a couple of good black cards and a couple of good white cards or something of that nature. So I would say people commit way too early in general when they're newer, and fixing that, you can do some guidelines, set up a set pick where you're going to want to have committed by, and then as you get better, you can set that later and later and just get rid of it altogether. Next question is from David DS. Is it better to play 1 to 2 colors with a solid deck, or go up to 4 to 5 colors to make use of all your bombs or strongest cards available? In Limited, it is generally far more advisable to go to 2 colors and then splash a third if you really need to, or have a really strong card available to you, simply because in Limited you don't have access to all of the dual lands and fetch lands and all of the things that make crazy mana bases work in Constructed. And so in Limited, you're just going to lose way more games to getting color screwed or mana, like not having the right mana, than you will to the benefits that you get when you do cast all of your powerful spells. There are some formats where there are exceptions to this, so maybe there are formats where there's really good mana fixing, and so then you can go more colors. Some formats incentivize you to go 3 colors or things like that, but generally 2 colors with a splash, if you have something really good, is what I would advise. Next question is from Bob. How do you use data from third-party sites, thinking 17 lands mostly? This is a very good question, and it was actually addressed in great detail in the most recent episode of Limited Resources, the podcast. I would really recommend checking that one out if you are interested in 17 lands data, because they had someone from that site on as a guest who discussed a lot of these things in detail. So I would recommend checking that out. But personally, the way I use the data a lot of the time is I like looking at, there's a way you can see when a card is taken on average in a pack. And I think that's very useful for trying to figure out which cards are overrated or underrated relative to where I am on a card. Because if I think a card is quite good and it's taken very late, then maybe I can build scenarios where I think of good synergies that would go with that card, or know that I can reliably get it if I do need it. Another metric I like looking at is the way that like when a card's win rate is much higher than I think it would be. I like looking at that as well, because that can sometimes be an indicator that I'm underrating a card. Although, yeah, generally those are the main ways I use it. There's a lot of really cool data stuff that you can do. I really am a big fan of data. Moving on to the next question. It's a little bit of a double header here from Cassiopeia. And the first one is, what is your opinion on splashing a third color in Limited? And how do you avoid dead cards in your hand regarding my third color? So, when you are splashing a card, you want to make sure that it's good around turn 6 or 7, because as Cassiopeia pointed out, it is going to be dead a lot of the time when you don't have the mana to cast it. And so that means that if you're trying to splash a card, you don't want to splash something that has to be cast on turn 2 or turn 3, because you're not going to have the mana to cast it consistently early in the game like that. So you want to make sure that it's a good card when you top deck that swamp to cast your black splash later in the game, or things like that. So a lot of the times a good removal spell will fit that bill, or like a really strong powerful like flyer that's good in the late game that's a really expensive card, or things like that are much better splashes, because if you are a little bit delayed getting the mana for it, it does justify that delay on being able to cast it. And that's generally my opinion on how to when you're splashing a card. You want to make sure that it's a good card on turn 6 or 7. That's a good baseline. And what cards are good sideboard cards for best of 3? Generally, the best sideboard cards that are like sideboard specific are the cards that are narrow but powerful. So if you have a card like Plummet, which is 1 and a green, destroy target flyer at instant speed, that's a card that's very narrow, because some decks don't have flyers and some decks have a lot of flyers. But in the matchups where it's good, in the matchups where your opponent has a couple of like 5 mana 4/4 flyers, all of a sudden you have a premium removal spell. So it's a perfect card to sideboard in for that sort of matchup, but not something you would like to main deck. Similarly, sometimes there are formats where there are some really powerful enchantments or artifacts to deal with. So a card like Naturalize, which is 1 and a green to destroy target artifact or enchantment at instant speed, that could be a really good sideboard card if your opponent shows, like if you see one or more good artifact, like a couple of really good artifacts in game 1 or something like that. Good questions, Cassiopeia. Next up to some questions from the Discord server. If you do want to join the Discord server, it is linked in the description down below. It's free to join for everybody, and you are all welcome. It comes from Doors, Drafter of Jank. How do you know when to move off your current lane and into another one? So we discussed this a little bit earlier with regards to when it is probably best to have committed to your 2 colors, but this is a little bit of a different angle on the question, so I did want to address it. A lot of the times when you're drafting, you get a kind of sixth sense, or at least I do, when you're like, oh, this doesn't feel right. Things feel a little bit off. And one of the signs of that can sometimes be a pack that just doesn't really have any of the cards of the color that you're trying to draft. So it'll be like pick 4 or 5, and you just all of a sudden see a pack that has no good white cards in it, or even solid white cards in it. And you're just like, oh no, this is a really bad sign. And generally, the way I avoid this sort of thing is just by staying flexible early, as I mentioned before, and making sure that I don't commit myself before I have to. Because sometimes you can have 3 or 4 black, like 3 black cards or 3 green cards or something like that, and still not have to commit to the color, because you still have plenty of draft left to get playables. And the longer you allow yourself to stay open, the longer you allow your senses to kind of absorb all of these like little signs that maybe you don't notice consciously, but that can give you that feeling of, okay, I'm in the right spot. This is where I want to be. So I would say sometimes you know that you're supposed to switch lanes if you get a really powerful card late. Like if I get a 6th pick card that should be going 2nd pick in like a blue card or something like that, that's a good signal that blue might be open. But generally it's just a lot of little signal points over time that kind of build up to letting you know that your colors aren't open or are open. Next is from I Like Shiny. It says, once a set has been out for a while, do you tend to draft or play 1 or 2 cards that your opponents won't expect you to have? For example, Beaming Defiance, I wouldn't expect to play around, so that card has wrecked me before. I would generally say that this should be a no answer from me. It's generally not best to play a card that you think is worse just to try and get tricksy with your opponents. I would recommend building the most powerful deck possible, and if that happens to include cards that you haven't played typically, then good for you, and that might fit within your like little mind game strategy. But generally, it's not going to have as big of an impact as you would hope, because a lot of the time, the only way that would work is if the people you were playing against had the exact same mindset as you, if they value the card in the same way. And a lot of players value cards very differently. So maybe for the person that's playing Beaming Defiance against you, they've had really good experiences with it, and so they think the card is quite good. And for you, you think the card's quite bad, so you don't play around it. Like, so if you play Beaming Defiance, just to be like mind gaming the opponents, you could just play against an opponent who thinks Beaming Defiance is totally good, and they play around it and wreck you, and play around it anyway. So I would generally say that it's not best to do that. Though I will say that there is something you can do in a kind of similar mental space, in that if you continually get wrecked by cards that you think are bad, it's good to go back to the drawing board and see if the card actually is bad. So for a card like Beaming Defiance, if you get wrecked by it 4 drafts in a row in spots that feel like you shouldn't be getting wrecked, maybe Beaming Defiance is better than you think it is, or things like that. So for example, Snakeskin Veil is a card that didn't necessarily look too powerful. It looked like solid, like an okay card, but I just continually get wrecked by it in high level events, hashtag Arena Open Day 2 multiple times. I'm so glad Strixhaven brought that back in the Mystical Archive slot, because yeah, flashbacks. But yeah, Snakeskin Veil is a card that consistently wrecked me, and so now I value it a little bit higher, because even though it doesn't necessarily look super powerful, it ends up performing quite well. And whenever I have it in hand, I feel very secure and things like that. So another example is in Strixhaven, I wasn't prioritizing Negate very highly, but then in a couple of key situations where I wasn't playing around Negate, my opponent wrecked me with it, like absolutely dumpstered me. And then I started trying it out. And when I did try it out, I reevaluated my perspective on it. And all of a sudden, I'm a big fan of Negate now. So be willing to reevaluate your opinions. Don't let you don't fall into the mindset of, oh, I got wrecked by a bad card. Rather think, maybe that card's better than I thought it was. Good question. Next question comes from Twitter. It's from MTGA user, and it says, in Cube, at what point should I focus on more constructed mindset or limited mindset? For example, if it is Vintage Cube, I know to try to focus on synergy and not just raw power, but in something like the Arena Cube, should I just look to take the best card in every pack? This is a very nuanced question and a very nuanced topic. Cube is complex, but I do like the direction this question goes, and I guess the answer is that Cube is different from drafting a typical set, in that a lot of the time it's going to be significantly more powerful, and the more powerful the cards in the cube are, the more you should treat it as constructing a deck. So in the Arena Cube, like for example, the most constructed like cube is Vintage Cube, and in Vintage Cube you can assemble something like Splinter Twin combo, which is a 2-card combo that wins you the game if you assemble it. That sort of thing doesn't really that sort of thing just doesn't happen in Arena Cube, so you don't build decks around little combos like that in the same way. However, I will say that Arena Cube is continuing to get more and more powerful as more sets get added to Arena. And so Arena Cube is definitely a cube where you want to make sure you have synergies. You want to make sure your deck has a game plan that's more powerful than just play good cards, because that sort of strategy, where you just play good cards, is going to be competitive against other decks that are playing on the same game plan. Like, okay, I play against another person who's saying, I'm going to play good cards, and I'm going to play good cards, and we both just battle it out, and maybe I have an edge because I'm a better player or something like that, but it's going to be a close match. But if I end up playing against someone who has a good cards and a synergistic game plan, all of a sudden they're going to be very significantly favored against me, and so you lose edges there. So you want to make sure that you have a synergistic deck, even if it is Arena Cube. And in Vintage Cube, you definitely want to make sure that you have a synergistic deck. Though I don't think I would ever go into constructed mindset type deal, because the deck lists aren't as set in stone as they are in constructed. Where in constructed, my opponent can play 2 cards, and all of a sudden I know all 60 that they have in their deck. Like, oh, play Fetch Land, shock myself with my Steam Vents, play Serum Visions. All of a sudden I've immediately narrowed down their possibilities to a couple of decks. But in draft, if they do that in Vintage Cube, I'm not going to like put them on any specific deck just yet. There's a lot more possibilities and a lot more things, so it's not like, oh, I can all of a sudden play around the exact cards that I know they have in their deck. So good question, and yeah, Cube is complex, but hopefully that answered your question. That is going to do it for the very first episode of DQA, Draft Questions Answered. Remember to hit that thumbs up button to help the video succeed. And also, if you want to see more episodes of this series in the future, remember we're going to head for 150 likes. And as this is a pilot episode, to make sure that this is something you folks want to see, because if it's not, I can do stuff that you would prefer more. Remember to comment with your questions as well about the questions that I just answered, and I'll do separate little posts about questions for this series. But if you have any questions about my answers, or you have any questions in general, leave those in the comment section down below. And remember to subscribe for more content. You can also leave hashtag questions complete in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video. It's always nice to see that little which people are the super viewers that made it all the way to the end. That's going to do it for this video, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.